Welcome back to part 3 of our mini lecture on the building tension between the Soviet Union and the United States of America in the late 1940s. So we've seen the development of the Truman Doctrine and its accompanying Marshall Plan. It's kind of the economic tack-on to the foreign policy of the Truman Doctrine, and it's really intended to make the Truman Doctrine work by supporting containing communism, just first of all by making people happy and wealthy so that they don't need to turn to communism. In this part, I want to explore a little bit more of what was happening inside Eastern Europe so that you understand a little bit more why the US was feeling so threatened at the time. And I've seen it referred to as almost like slicing salami is the term I've seen. And what Stalin was doing was ensuring the building of those buffer zones around the Soviet Union, bit by bit, like slicing salami, just slice by slice, building up a strong buffer zone, which the US saw as very threatening and saw it as the spread of communism and Stalin's expansionist policies. To begin with, Stalin had what we can call a policy of national roads to socialism and allowing locals to form their own governments, supported by the Red Army, and the local communists were basically given a lot of backing and military support if they needed it in order to establish communist control within those countries. And we often saw alliances between many left-wing parties with communist leadings. They were Soviet-friendly governments, and certainly the Red Army was there on the ground to support those local communists to assert their control within those countries. However, with the development of the Truman Doctrine, and in particular the Marshall Plan, Stalin needed to step up. As we're going to see, already a lot of countries had moved towards communism in Eastern Europe before 1947, but Stalin had to ensure that they were able to resist the lure of the money offered by the Marshall Plan, and so we saw a much firmer stamp being put on Eastern Europe by Stalin and the Soviet Union by the end of 1947. Now, I'm going to give you some examples of countries in the East so you get a feel for how they ended up being communist, or at least in this Soviet sphere of influence. However, you're not expected to know the history of each country. I'm just showing you a number so you get a feel for how communism was being spread or imposed, as the case may be, in Eastern Europe. And it will help you understand a little bit more about the threat being felt by the US and the West. So here again, we've got what ended up as a Soviet sphere of influence, and all of these reddy, pinky countries were certainly Soviet influenced or run by communist governments. Those in the West, excluding Spain, basically signed up to the Marshall Plan, and we can see this clear division between East and West that occurred. Let's start by looking at Poland. Poland is an important thing to look at because it was the reason why the Allies went to war in the first place in World War II. And as we could see at the Yalta and the Potsdam conferences, Britain in particular was very concerned about the future of Poland, wanting to ensure an independent Poland. Yet by 1944, as we know, the Red Army had occupied Poland in its march across Europe. And later in 1944, a provisional, temporary government was established in Poland, which was mostly controlled by communists from within the country. In 1945, at the Yalta Conference, Stalin did agree that there would be a new Polish government that would be a coalition, including communists, yes, but would also include some of the Poles who had been living in London in exile during World War II. So they did come and they did form a part of the Polish government, but certainly the communists backed by the Red Army, who were there on the ground in Poland, continued to hold a majority of power. By 1946, Poland was supposed to be moving towards free elections, but these were avoided. While the communists had control in Poland at the time, they were concerned that there may have been a lack of popular support. So instead of holding elections, they moved towards banning right-wing parties. It's an easy place to start given the impact that the fascist right-wing governments had had in Poland, but this was just the starting point. By 1947, elections were held in Poland, but they were rigged elections. That is, they were set up in a way to ensure that the communists would win and stay in control of Poland. By the end of 1947, there were Soviet advisors in every government department, within the army, and across the whole police force. Stalin was ensuring that there was going to be strong communist control of Poland and that they were going to implement plans and an approach which was very Soviet influenced. And we can see that by 1950, they'd put in place economic planning, Soviet-style economic planning with 5-year plans and many aspects of Soviet culture, including Soviet realism, new forms of education to emphasize the wonders of communism. And so we see very much a heavy Soviet influence in Poland. Romania is another country that starts with local communists, really establishing a communist-style government, and ends up with further force being put on to ensure that it stayed communist as the 1940s progressed. So again, 1944, we see the Red Army moving in to liberate Romania from the Nazis. And in 1944, there was actually a range of political parties organised to form a new government. The communists were not particularly popular at that stage in Romania, and certainly a non-communist is appointed to begin with by Romania's King Michael, but it collapsed very soon. After the Yalta Conference in 1945, Romania almost broke into civil war between the communists and the non-communists. And in order to save Romania from civil war, King Michael decided to appoint a communist who was backed by the Red Army, who, remember, are there in Romania. He appoints a communist government to ensure that Romania does not fall into civil war. And from that point on, the communists are now in power and ensure that they stay in power. So 1946, there's elections in Romania, but again, they are rigged elections, making sure that the communists are elected and in power. By 1947 in Romania, all other political parties have been driven into exile, leaving the communists to completely dominate Romania and make sure that a Soviet-influenced government and style of control remain. So what we've got now is this is the Soviet Union here in the darker red, and two of its closest neighbours, Poland and Romania, are now firmly under the control of communist governments. Czechoslovakia is a little bit different. As you can see, only a small amount of Czechoslovakia actually borders on to the Soviet Union, and the Soviet influence in Czechoslovakia was not quite as strong. During 1944-1945, the Red Army had marched into Czechoslovakia to liberate it from the Nazi regime. And elections were held in 1946. Communists did win 114 of the 300 seats in the free elections, and certainly are a major part of a new government. They are not, however, in complete control. When we get to July 1947 and the Marshall Plan comes out, the Czech government was very keen to actually accept the aid that was being offered by the United States. Stalin, however, sent a very clear message to the Czech government that he was not keen, and in fact said, you will not accept aid under the Marshall Plan. And there are a number of members of the Czech government who actually resigned in protest over this interference. Kind of a silly move in many ways, because once the non-communists left the government, it left the communists in control. And from that point forward, we see a stronger influence from Stalin to ensure that Czechoslovakia would remain one of those friendly states in his buffer zones. In February 1948, the communists actually took over the headquarters of other political parties and established a communist-only government. And in March 1948, the non-communist foreign minister, a guy called Masaryk, was found dead. Now, there's still no clear evidence to say if he was murdered or if it was a suicide, but there was a clear implication that any non-communist members were no longer welcome in the Czechoslovakian government, and all non-communists were forced to leave the government. Some of them were never seen again. Some of them were lucky enough to be able to leave Czechoslovakia. And so what we see with Czechoslovakia in 1948 is forced intervention by the Soviet Union to ensure that Czechoslovakia became a friendly buffer state and friend to the Soviet Union. Have a think about the way that the United States would react to these actions taking place in Czechoslovakia through 1947 and 1948. And certainly they would feel justified in their new Truman Doctrine and their policy of trying to intervene to stop the spread of communism. One more country I want to introduce you to is Yugoslavia. You can see Yugoslavia here is further away from the Soviet Union up here and has a slightly different history and a slightly different path through the Cold War. In Yugoslavia, it hadn't been the Soviet Red Army who had come to liberate Yugoslavia from Nazi occupation. Instead, it had been a local war hero, Tito, General Tito, who is able to gather enough forces and actually fight off the Nazis for themselves. And so he was the leader of Yugoslavia from 1943. Now, Tito himself is very much a socialist, very socialist leanings, very leaning towards Soviet-style approach. However, Tito is very much a strong individual and had very strong popular following across Yugoslavia. And with this, he was able to create very much individual policy, communist leaning, yes, but separate from the Soviet Union. Yugoslavia was actually seen as a threat by Stalin. Even though they were communists, he wanted them to be more clearly influenced by the Soviet Union, but Tito was strong enough to resist. Yugoslavia initially joined Stalin's Cominform, which was set up in 1947. But by 1948, Tito understood that if he wanted to be able to do his own thing, his own way, he had to break away from the Soviet Union. And he did this. And he was strong enough to do it without the Soviet Union being able to keep them as a part of that Soviet bloc. So what we see through the Cold War is Yugoslavia is a communist country controlled by Tito well into about 1990. But it's a communist country, but it is not a Soviet country. And what we will see is that Yugoslavia will do its own thing during the Cold War period. Stayed impartial. Sometimes it actually had alliances with what was going on in the West, and at other times it supported the Soviet Union. So Yugoslavia is an interesting case study. Communist country, but not a Soviet-influenced country. And we will see its neighbour Albania is pretty much the same. At first, part of the Soviet Union, it then is able to break away and instead becomes influenced by its closer neighbour, Yugoslavia. So as you can see, the east of Europe was turning red, according to our map, was becoming communist, and certainly the US was very threatened by this, giving rise to its Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan. But as each side takes a step, because it feels threatened and increases its own reaction, we see the other side feeling even more threatened again. And therefore what we're seeing is constantly an increase in tension during this time, until we get to probably the next event we're going to be looking at is the Berlin blockade, which is kind of an outbreak to really test all of these policies and ideologies which each side has put into place. And that's it on our lectures on the increase in tensions.